We are a national nonprofit that supports children and families with gold standard mental health care, advice, and resources, all online and accessible to everyone. During the coronavirus crisis, our telehealth resources include diagnosis and treatment of mental health and learning disorders remotely, 30-minute phone consultations, bereavement and grief support, remote neuropsychological evaluations. That's just a sampling. Please visit childmind.org/telehealth to learn more about the resources we have available during this time. Today, I will be talking about coordinating school and other resources during remote learning, which I know is a topic that lots of people have had questions about, both families that I've worked with individually and also in our social media as well. And I'm also here to answer questions about any other topics around parenting during the time of coronavirus. So feel free to post those questions in the feed. We will also post some links to helpful resources after the live is over that are available on childmind.org. Remember, we're here every day and we look through your questions daily. So I will go ahead and get started with a little bit of information about some of the questions I've been getting from families that I work with individually. And then as questions come in, I will answer those as well. So one thing to think about is that we know the coronavirus crisis is changing the way that kids are learning. It is changing the way that you're communicating with schools in so many ways. We know from prior to the coronavirus crisis that when we were in normal operating times, school-home communication was something that was extremely important when we think about kids' outcomes in learning. So there is lots of research to support that parents who are involved in their child's education, who are having regular communication with their child's teacher, whether that's just with drop-off and pickup or whether it's regular communication through parent-teacher conferences, this really positively impacts kids' outcomes in school. So while we're in this new territory of remote learning, something that I've been thinking about a lot personally and also with the families I work with is how to keep that communication going in a really productive way to support your child's learning throughout this process, with everything now being remote. So there's a few consistent themes that have been coming up that I thought I would share and kind of talk through, as these are things that like I said, we've seen pop up in questions, and we've also heard from the families that we work with individually. One of these is that throughout this time, you may be getting a much closer eye on the areas that your child is really succeeding in, as well as the areas that your child is experiencing challenges with. So for the first time, you might have an eye on how your child moves through the day-to-day of school more than what you got right when you were just assisting with homework. So you're seeing how your child transitions, how they organize their materials, how long they're able to attend to the remote lesson for, right? How they engage and raise their hand and participate. You're getting a lot more information than you might have had before. And this is really good. It may be stressful, we know it's stressful, to see and have to sort of support your child through these challenges, but it's also really, really helpful information to assist you in figuring out whether your child might need additional support, or, right, whether this is really just the impact of remote learning. So we know that for many kids, some of the difficulties that they're having right now with attention, focus, staying in front of the screen, keeping things organized, not getting distracted, some of those are really just because remote learning is different, right? Remote learning is very different. It's very different for kids who don't have really the attentional abilities to stay in front of the screen for all that long. It's also really difficult and different for kids who now have access to all sorts of things in their environment that previously, when they left the house for the day to go to school, they didn't have access to. So you're sitting maybe and doing schoolwork in the very same room that your TV is, that your video games are, that your phone is, all of these things that we know can be really distracting. So all this to say, you may be seeing changes in how your child's engaging with schoolwork that are just because remote learning is different and the environment is different. You also might be picking up on some challenges that actually existed in the classroom as well, that your child's teacher might have been providing a lot of extra support with that you didn't necessarily realize. And that's really helpful. So if you're noticing that your child is having challenges, right, you're noticing some of the distractibility or difficulties with particular subjects, maybe they're having difficulty specifically with engaging with writing, making a choice about a topic, maybe they're having a hard time staying focused with math or getting through those exercises. This is really good information to share with your child's teacher and just check in, right? Check in and find out, was this something that was happening when my child was going to the classroom, when my child was in school before the coronavirus crisis, right? Were these issues that you guys were aware of and were addressing? Because that can really help us to figure out if maybe there's some additional support that your child needs, or maybe there was support that they were already getting that was sufficient. So one way to make these conversations most productive with teachers is to really keep track of some data in a clear and concise way that then you can share with them. Teachers are really well versed in collecting data in an ABC format. I've talked about this format a few times because we love it in the world of behavioral therapy, in the world of sort of behavioral data collection. The ABC data really involves writing those three letters out on a sheet of paper, right? The A stands for antecedents, or what is happening first. So maybe that is your child transitioned from writing to math, right? That's your A. That's what happened first. The B stands for what's the behavior. So the behavior in that situation might have been that your child started to cry, yell, walk away from the screen, right? Rip up the paper. Who knows? It could be a variety of behaviors that you're noticing. Maybe they just look like they're daydreaming or they're distracted. But that's going to go in that column labeled B that stands for behavior. And then the C is the consequence, or what happened next. So meaning, did your child exhibit this behavior for the entirety of the lesson and then the lesson ended and they weren't finished with their work? So they actually got out of the assignment? Did it mean that they had to continue on for much longer than the rest of the class? Did they get some sort of one-on-one feedback from the teacher or from you? What happened after this behavior? So those are ABCs. We're thinking antecedent, what happened first, behavior, what was the behavior you saw, and consequence, what happened after. Keeping the track of data in that way leads to much more productive conversations with providers, meaning your teachers, but also meaning any kind of outside service provider that you might be interacting with. That could be, right, if you do need to go to the step of an evaluation process with a mental health professional or a neuropsych evaluation, that information is so valuable for us, right? It really helps us to understand what's at the root of kids' behavior. So if you're making these observations, keeping track of it in that way and just a notepad is a really helpful way to start these conversations with providers and with teachers. It's really, really helpful to share these observations with your teachers, also so that they can share with you what strategies might have been in place in the classroom that could help make this process easier for you and for your child. So one thing I've been talking a lot about with families is how parents are definitely realizing that teachers are rock stars, and they were using a whole lot of strategies to get kids through the day. And a lot of these strategies are just not things that most parents are used to, trained in, right, familiar with, or maybe even realized were happening. So your child was unlikely to be sitting in the classroom, particularly a young elementary school age child, right? Was unlikely to be sitting in the classroom, engaging in long periods of independent work without adult support. Most likely, there were a lot of classroom-wide supports that were happening inside the classroom that were part of the everyday structure of that environment. We know that good classrooms have tons of behavioral strategies packed into them to help every child be successful with learning. Those strategies, depending on the classroom and depending on your child's age, might have involved visual schedules, visual timers, word walls for writing, right? Resource areas where your child could have gone to pick up ideas for their writing assignment, manipulatives that they could have used when they're working through a math exercise. So there's all sorts of classroom supports that teachers are using to both help your child learn academically and also to manage some of the behaviors that might be popping up, like distractibility, like frustration. So if you're finding that your child is really struggling to engage in a particular area of the learning, one great question to ask teachers is, right, what were some of these supports that were in place for my child or for the entire classroom that I might actually be able to replicate at home? We know you can't do all of it by any means, but a small piece like finding out that your child really did utilize and benefit from a word wall is huge, right? If that simple strategy of giving them a list of words that they can choose from visually would help them to make the writing easier and would help you to not need to do as much prompting throughout the various assignments, that's amazing, right? That's such a small thing that we can do that can make a big difference. So checking in with teachers, actually having these conversations and letting them know where your child is struggling can be really, really helpful in making progress and also identifying spots where your child may have pre-existing difficulties that need to be addressed. The other piece that has been coming up a lot is this issue of what to do about related services. So if your child had an IEP in place and was receiving either in school or perhaps privately related services like speech, OT, PT, these are things that lots of people are finding that kids are having a bit of a hard time engaging with, or that parents aren't sure how to utilize during this time. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit as well in kind of a similar vein to share some ways that families I've been working with have been addressing this issue. So one of the big pieces is for kids who are having a hard time, especially our younger kids, engaging with those related services remotely. It's weird, right? It's very strange to be on the screen and need to engage in things like speech occupational therapy that typically had been in person and involving lots of activity to support the process. So if your child is struggling to engage, this is another spot to, again, check in with the provider and actually find out if we're missing some of the supports that had been really helpful for your child to engage previously. So it might be that your child actually did have a reward chart in place to engage with speech, right? Or to engage with OT, where each time they completed a certain amount of timed exercises, they were able to cash in for a break, a game, a sticker, some sort of reinforcer. If that was happening in person, odds are we're definitely going to need it even more so when your child is being asked to engage remotely. So it's really helpful to check in with that provider and find out what resources would be helpful to set up to make the environment most supportive of your child being successful with those services. One question that we've gotten is really about what IEPs actually should look like during this time. Keep in mind that Iep meetings should still be taking place, even though they're taking place virtually or remotely. Your child should still be receiving their related services. And so it may look different, right, and be adapted to the current virtual climate, but those services should still be taking place. Paraprofessional services should also still exist. That part's really tough. And one thing I know many families have been getting our help with is how to figure out how to use those paraprofessional services most effectively right now, since that person is unable, obviously, to be with you in your home. You may need to use some creative sort of tech solutions to make sure that your child's getting the one-to-one support and feedback that they benefit from in this virtual classroom climate. So if people have questions about that, please feel free to throw them into the chat. I'm happy to answer those. We've been talking through that a lot with families lately. All right, I've got some questions that we had from earlier that I would love to address now. Let's go with this one, which is that my daughter participates or participated in many in-school extracurriculars and after-school activities. Those seem to be almost gone now. No art class, no band, no track, etc. And her education is the poorer for it. What can I do to help fill in the gaps? I thought this was a really great question, and obviously something that people are really struggling with, actually more so right for our somewhat older kids. So our middle schoolers and our high schoolers whose identity was really wrapped up in a lot of these extracurricular activities in an appropriate way. We actually expect that developmentally our middle schoolers and our high schoolers are starting to build identities through these extracurriculars, through activities that they're engaging in outside of the family system. So you're right. We do really want these things for kids in that age range. They're really valuable and they're a huge part of the education. And so the question is how do we deal with that now in the current climate? It's hard, but there also are a lot of local and national organizations actually providing remote extracurricular activities right now. It's not going to look the same, but one tip is sort of to look into both first in your local community to see what organizations outside of the school, for example, dance studios, art studios, right? Even some gyms, right, that might offer some virtual activities for kids. Those are great resources. Many folks have found that those local organizations are starting to offer some type of online resource, either live time or something that you can get on demand for your child that can fill in some of those gaps. So while it's not the same as being part of a peer group that's involved in dance or that's involved in track, and that part we're going to maybe need to supplement in other ways through peer-to-peer play dates and things like that, keeping up the educational pieces of being involved in virtual art classes, virtual dance classes. A lot of the museums are offering some of these things too. So maybe that's not in your local area, right? But those are national organizations that are providing virtual classes for kids, virtual art classes, virtual museum tours, things like that. So I know Lincoln Center is doing that, MoMA's doing that, and certainly there's a lot of resources in communities too of smaller studios that are providing those types of supports. So see if you can use those to fill in some of those gaps. Also, one I didn't mention is there's an illustrator, Mo Willems, who's doing this art hour, lunch hour. That's also a really helpful supplement. If your child was involved in a lot of art classes previously, it's a great supplement for that as well. All right. Another one that we got previously goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, but really the question is, my son is having a hard time concentrating during remote learning. Any suggestions on how to help would be great. So as we already talked about, step one is really this piece of trying to gather some data and observations on what is precipitating the difficulty concentrating. So are you seeing it all day long, or are you actually seeing it in a particular subject area or at a particular time of the day? That information is extremely helpful to then decide what types of strategies will be appropriate. Like we talked about, second step is really checking with the teacher, find out if this is a new issue specific to remote learning or if this was a pre-existing issue. If it's a pre-existing issue, one thing to think about, obviously with conversation with your child's teachers, is to find out if now might be the time to engage in an evaluation process. And so by that, I mean, right, something like a neuropsychological evaluation to see if your child has any underlying learning or mental health difficulties that we could be addressing in some other way. Or if this was an issue that was existing in the classroom, but was very well managed by traditional classroom strategies. And then that goes back to this piece of your teacher sharing with you, what are those strategies that we were using? What kinds of supports were we giving to your child that might be helpful during this time? We are offering remote evaluations. Many places are offering remote evaluations. And so know that if your teacher is saying, actually, this was something that existed before and we're concerned about it, you are able to get those supports now. And so you can, as we said before, childmind.org/telehealth, you can see how we are structuring some of those evaluations to get your child's needs met if there's more of an issue going on than what your teacher feels is managed with traditional strategies. Other tips are just to try to make sure that the environment is free of distraction in as many ways as you can, right? That is really hard right now, but trying to think about having a dedicated space where your child's doing their work, a cleared off area where TV is off, music is off, right? Making sure that it's free of auditory distractions as well as visual distractions. It is also helpful to save preferred activities for once remote learning is over. So making sure that your child knows that if they finish a particular activity for school, that then they're going to get access to an activity that they prefer. Making sure it's in that order is really important for maintaining focus and attention. And then the last one is using visual timers and checklist systems. These are really helpful for maintaining attention and focus for kids. So the visual timers are used to really let your child know how long they need to focus on the activity before they're able to transition to, like I said before, something preferred. And the checklist system just helps your child to really know what are the steps of their day and what do they need to get done. So all of those visuals we know really help, particularly with younger children. All right, just checking to see if we've got any questions. And then I've got one last one I can share with you guys before we wrap up. Awesome, great question. So Jennifer asked, how can I make a telehealth appointment with a therapist? Awesome question. So we at the Child Mind Institute, I don't know where you're located, but we are taking we are doing telehealth evaluations and starting telehealth therapy with new patients right now. And we were able to do that in many states, actually. So depending on where you are, check out our website, childmind.org/telehealth. There's information there to call our intake department and go ahead and schedule an appointment with a clinician. So they will direct you to the right person depending on your child's needs and what the concerns are, and make sure that you get with the right clinician. And from there, we can do telehealth therapy, remote evaluations, and all that good stuff. Great question. And then the last question that I actually have from before is a question about services for children with dyslexia. So someone was asking tips for finding a remote tutor for their son with dyslexia and asking kind of what credentials to look for, particular types of models of intervention that might be appropriate. The first thing that I can say is that for kids with dyslexia, we do know that there's some specific reading programs that are proven to be more effective than traditional tutoring. And so those are things like the Wilson method, the Orton-Gillingham approach is one that we know works well for children with dyslexia, Linda Mood-Bell program. Those are a few. We also have a lot of resources available for this on our website, meaning resources to connect you in the right direction. So on our website at childmind.org/coronavirus, our Learning and Development Center has set up a guide of family resources with all sorts of resources for remote learning. So it also does include a section that's specifically for dyslexia to direct families to programs that might be effective and also programs that are existing remotely. So if you have questions about that, that's a great resource for you guys to check out on our website. All right, I'm just checking out some remaining questions. And then I think it is actually about time for us to wrap it up, but I appreciate the questions that are coming in. And we will get you guys some resources from our website as well. Like I said, we've got some good stuff on remote learning. So if you have follow-up questions, check those out. There's some really good stuff to address your questions there. I want to thank you all for joining me today. I hope it was helpful. And remember, we are here every day and we look through questions daily. Child Mind Institute is here to help with your mental health and parenting needs during this coronavirus crisis, no matter where you are. Please visit childmind.org/telehealth to learn more about the variety of resources that we have available during this time. Be safe and thank you.